Chapter 2, Veins. Disclaimer: I do not own the rights to the images or information provided. This was purely made from me to study for boards. The veins inside the cranial cavity are not accompanied by arteries. The venous sinuses of the cranial dura mater large venous passageways located within the dura or within bony canals in the skull unaccompanied by arteries. The sinuses receive the veins draining the brain parenchyma and the bones of the skull. The sinuses ultimately convey venous blood to the paired maxillary, interjugular, and vertebral veins into the ventral internal vertebral venous plexuses. The dorsal sagittal sinus is located in the attached portion of the falx cerebri, which is a fold of dura extending ventrally into the longitudinal cerebral fissure between the two cerebral hemispheres. It extends from the cribriform plate to the occipital bone. Caudally, this sinus enters the foramen for the dorsal sagittal sinus in the occipital bone dorsal to where the tentorium attaches. There, it joins the right and left transverse sinuses. The dorsal sagittal sinus receives numerous branches from the dorsal surface of each hemisphere as well as many of the diploic veins. At the entrance into the foramen for the dorsal sagittal sinus, this sinus is joined ventrally by the short straight sinus. This straight sinus is in the caudal margin of the falx cerebri. It is short and formed by the union of the great cerebral vein and the internal cerebral veins. The great cerebral vein receives the vein of the corpus callosum, which is unpaired, courses caudally on the dorsal surface of the corpus callosum and receives small tributaries from the medial aspect of both cerebral hemispheres. The great cerebral vein receives the paired internal cerebral veins from the dorsal surface of the thalamus. The internal cerebral veins receive venous drainage from the thalamostriate veins from the thalamus and basal nuclei in the rostral cerebrum as well as venous drainage from the dorsal mesencephalon. Variations in the pattern of branching are common. Each transverse sinus runs laterally through the transverse canal and sulcus. At a distal end of the sulcus, at the dorsal border of the petrosal part of the temporal bone, the sinus divides into a temporal sinus and a sigmoid sinus. The temporal sinus courses quadrilateral to the petrosal part of the temporal bone and extends to the retroarticular foramen, where it emerges as the emissary vein of the retroarticular foramen and joins the maxillary vein. Each sigmoid sinus forms an S-shaped curve as it courses over the dorsomedial side of the petrous part of the temporal bone. It passes through the jugular foramen into the tympano-occipital fissure. Within the fissure, the ventral petrosal sinus enters rostrally from the petro-occipital canal and joins the sigmoid sinus. From this anastomosis, the vertebral and internal jugular veins arise and leave the tympano-occipital fissure and course caudally. The vertebral vein descends the neck through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. The internal jugular vein courses caudally in the carotid sheath. The basilar sinus is a branch of the sigmoid sinus that continues caudally through the condyloid canal to the ventral internal vertebral venous plexus in the vertebral canal. The cavernous sinus lies on each side of the floor of the middle cranial fossa from the orbital fissure to the petro-occipital canal. Emissary veins connect each cavernous sinus with the ophthalmic plexus of veins rostrally and with the maxillary vein laterally. These sinuses are each continued caudally by the ventral petrosal sinus, which lies in the petro-occipital canal. 2 or 3 intercavernous sinuses connect the left and right cavernous sinuses rostral and caudal to the hypophysis. The internal carotid artery courses through the cavernous sinus. The ventral internal vertebral venous plexuses are paired vessels that lie on the floor of the vertebral canal in the epidural connective tissue. See Figure 2-6. They extend from the venous sinuses of the cranium throughout the vertebral canal. At each intervertebral foramen, intervertebral veins connect the ventral internal vertebral venous plexus with the vertebral veins of the neck, intercostal veins of the thorax, azygos and costa cervical veins, and lumbar veins, caudal vena cava. In the abdomen, a continuous venous pathway exists from the angularis oculi vein, through the external ophthalmic vein, ophthalmic plexus, cavernous sinus, ventral petrosal sinus, sigmoid sinus, and the basilar sinus in the condyloid canal, to the ventral internal vertebral venous plexus. This pathway can be demonstrated radiographically by compressing the external jugular veins and injecting a radiopaque solution into the angularis oculi vein on the side of the face near the medial angle of the eye. This procedure can be used clinically to diagnose space-occupying lesions that interfere with this pathway. It can also be used anatomically to inject the venous system with various materials.